Death doesn't just break your heart. It empties your pockets. Claire had $42 to her name, a dead husband in the morgue, and a funeral director waiting for a check she couldn't write. She was entirely out of options. Then the ground began to shake. The Hells Angels had arrived. The business of dying is far more efficient than the business of living. Claire sat in a leather-backed chair that hissed softly when she shifted her weight. Across the heavy oak desk sat Richard Gable, a man whose entire professional demeanor was constructed around measured sympathy. He wore a charcoal suit that looked expensive but dull. He had soft, uncalloused hands that had never turned a wrench or bled over a rusted engine block. Not like Robbie's. "I understand this is a difficult time, Mrs. Jennings," Richard said. His voice was a practiced baritone, smooth and completely devoid of actual warmth. He tapped a gold-plated pen against a glossy brochure. "But the county has specific regulations regarding remains, and we require a 50% deposit before we can proceed with the preparation and the viewing." Claire stared at the brochure. It featured a peaceful meadow and a softly glowing sunrise. Below the image, a column of numbers was neatly printed. The cheapest option, ironically labeled the Basic Rest package, was $5,800. "I don't have it," Claire said. Her voice was flat. The tears had stopped 2 days ago, replaced by a hollow, gnawing panic. "I have $42 in my checking account. My husband's life insurance policy lapsed 6 months ago when we had to choose between paying the premium and buying his pain medication." Richard's sympathetic smile tightened. Just a fraction. It was the look of a businessman realizing a deal was going south. "Is the family? Someone who might be able to co-sign a loan? We partner with a wonderful financing firm." "He was an orphan," Claire cut in. "And my parents have been gone for a decade. It's just me." She looked away from the funeral director, her gaze drifting to the frost-covered window of his office. The sky outside was the color of dirty concrete. It was February in Oakhaven, a town where the factories had shuttered in the 90s and never came back. It was a place that ground you down slowly. Robbie had fought that grind his whole life. He was a mechanic, a good one. He owned a small 2-bay garage on the edge of town where he fixed things other people had given up on. He had a gift for coaxing life out of dead machines. But when the pancreatic cancer hit, there was no fixing it. It was brutal, fast, and catastrophically expensive. They sold the garage first, then the tools, then the 1970 Chevelle Robbie had been restoring since they were in their 20s. The disease ate his body, and the healthcare system ate their life. By the time Robbie finally stopped breathing in the sterile, fluorescent-lit hospice room, there was nothing left. No assets, no savings, just a mountain of medical debt and a terrifying silence. "Mrs. Jennings," Richard began again, his tone slightly firmer now. "If you cannot secure the funds, the alternative is a state burial. A pauper's grave. It's handled by the municipality. There is no ceremony, no marker." The words hit her like a physical blow. A pauper's grave. After 32 years of working 60-hour weeks, after paying his taxes and helping neighbors pull their cars out of snowbanks for free, Robbie was going to be dropped into an unmarked hole by strangers. Claire stood up. Her knees trembled, but she locked them. She pulled her worn wool coat tighter around her thin frame. "I need a day. Give me 24 hours to figure something out." Richard closed the brochure. "We can hold the remains until tomorrow evening, Mrs. Jennings. After that, we must notify the county." Claire didn't say goodbye. She walked out of the heavily perfumed air of the funeral home and into the biting winter wind. The cold felt good. It was sharp and real. She climbed into her beat-up sedan, a 15-year-old Honda that Robbie had kept running through sheer willpower. The engine hesitated, then caught. She gripped the steering wheel, staring at her own white knuckles. "I'm sorry, Rob," she whispered to the empty passenger seat. "I'm so damn sorry. The drive home was a blur of grey slush and grey buildings. Claire felt utterly detached from the world. People were in their cars, going to work, buying groceries, living their lives. Didn't they know the world had stopped? Didn't they know the best man in Oakhaven was lying in a refrigerated drawer with a toe tag? When she pulled into a cracked driveway, the silence of her small, aluminum-sided house was deafening. The front porch step was still broken. Robbie had promised to fix it the week before his diagnosis. She unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The house smelled of stale dust and old coffee. Claire walked into the kitchen and sat at the Formica table. A stack of mail sat in the center. Final notices, collection warnings. The math of poverty was simple and absolute. You cannot multiply 0. She put her head down on the table, resting her cheek against the cold surface, and finally allowed the cynicism to overtake her. You play by the rules your whole life. You work hard. You love your spouse. You don't steal. You don't cheat. And what is the reward? You die in agony, and your wife begs a man in a cheap suit for a pine box. The universe wasn't just indifferent, it was cruel. She closed her eyes, exhausted to her marrow, wishing the cold creeping through the drafty windows would just freeze her solid. It started as a low, guttural vibration. Claire was still sitting at the kitchen table an hour later, a mug of instant coffee growing cold in her hands. She thought it was a snowplow at first. The heavy, rhythmic thrumming vibrated through the floorboards, rattling the cheap ceramic plates in the cupboards. But the sound didn't pass by. It grew louder, multiplying into a deafening, unified roar that completely swallowed the quiet of the neighborhood. Claire frowned, standing up and pulling her cardigan tight. She walked into the living room and peeked through the dusty Venetian blinds. Her breath hitched. Her small, crumbling driveway was filled with chrome and matte black metal. 12 heavy cruiser motorcycles were parked in a staggered formation, taking up the driveway and spilling over onto the dead grass of her front lawn. The exhaust smoke hung thick in the freezing air, a hazy grey cloud. Men were dismounting. Huge men in heavy leather jackets, thick boots, and denim. On the back of their jackets, the unmistakable winged death head patch stood out in stark relief. Underneath it, the bottom rocker read, Hell's Angels, Oakhaven. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in Claire's chest. The local Hell's Angels chapter operated out of a fortified compound on the south side of the county. They were ghosts to most of the town, seen passing on the highways, heard in the distance, but rarely interacting with the suburban neighborhoods. What did they want? Did Robbie owe them money? Was there some hidden debt he had never told her about? He used to do custom machining for some of the bikers years ago, but he had always sworn it was just business, strictly parts and labor. The neighbors were reacting. Across the street, Mrs. Higgins yanked her curtains shut. Next door, a man hurriedly pulled his children off the sidewalk and locked his front door. The police wouldn't come out here unless someone called, and nobody in this neighborhood was brave enough to call the cops on a dozen fully patched Hell's Angels. The leader of the pack killed his engine last. He was a mountain of a man, easily 6'4", with a thick, graying beard, and a face that looked like it had been carved out of an old piece of driftwood. He took off his heavy leather gloves, tucked them into his belt, and began walking up the broken concrete path to Claire's front door. 3 other men, equally intimidating, followed a few paces behind. Claire stepped back from the window. The doorbell didn't ring. It had been broken for months. Instead, a heavy gloved fist knocked 3 times on the wooden frame. The whole door rattled. She considered not answering. She considered running out the back door, but she was exhausted, and she was already at rock bottom. You can't threaten a woman who has nothing left to lose. She turned the deadbolt and pulled the door open. The man on her porch seemed to block out the grey sky. Up close, he smelled of gasoline, tobacco, and old leather. He looked down at her, his dark eyes entirely unreadable. A scar cut through his left eyebrow, disappearing into his hairline. His vest was covered in patches, pins, and grease stains. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was shockingly deep, a gravelly rumble that matched his machine. "I'm looking for Robbie Jennings." Claire swallowed hard. Her voice shook, no matter how hard she tried to control it. "Robbie isn't here." "When's he back?" the man asked. He didn't sound threatening, just impatient. "He's not," Claire said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "Robbie passed away. He died on Tuesday." The silence on the porch was absolute. The background noise of the other bikers talking and shifting instantly ceased. The three men behind the leader froze. The big man stared at her for a long moment. Then, slowly, he reached up and pulled a heavy silver chain over his head, adjusting his collar. He took a step back, and his entire posture shifted. The aggression melted away, replaced by a rigid, formal stillness. "I'm sorry to hear that," the man said softly. "Cancer?" "Yes," Claire whispered. "Pancreatic." The man nodded slowly. He looked past her, glancing at the empty living room, the worn-out furniture. He looked back at Claire, his eyes dropping to the final notice envelopes she had accidentally carried to the door in her hand. "My name's Jack," he said. "They call me Diesel. I'm the president of the local charter. Robbie was a good man, Mrs. Jennings. He was a mechanic," Claire said defensively, still terrified they were here to collect a phantom debt. "He just fixed bikes. He wasn't involved in anything else." Diesel offered a small, grim smile. "We know what he was. 6 years ago, I broke down on Route 9 in the middle of a sleet storm. Threw a rod. I pushed my shovelhead 3 miles to his shop. It was 2 a.m. He was in there doing inventory. He didn't lock the door. He pulled my bike into the bay, gave me a cup of hot coffee, and spent the next 12 hours rebuilding the top end of my motor." Diesel paused, looking down at his scarred hands. "When it was done, I asked him what I owed him. He looked at my cuts, looked at my boots with holes in them, and told me the parts were under warranty and the labor was free. He said a man shouldn't be separated from his ride because of a streak of bad luck." Claire felt a sudden, sharp sting behind her eyes. That was Robbie. To a fault. He would give away his last dollar if he thought someone needed it more. "He was too generous for his own good," Claire managed to say, her voice cracking. "In this world, maybe." Diesel agreed. He looked at her closely. "When's the service, Mrs. Jennings?" The question broke her. The dam she had been holding up since the funeral home collapsed. She covered her face with her hands, a dry, racking sob escaping her chest. "There isn't one," she cried, humiliatingly exposed in front of these hardened outlaws. "There's no service. I can't afford it. The funeral director is going to call the county tomorrow. They're going to put him in a pauper's grave. I couldn't save his life, and I can't even buy him a decent box." She leaned against the doorframe, crying into her hands. She expected them to walk away. The world was uncomfortable with grief. People always walked away when the tears started, but Diesel didn't move. He stood on the broken porch step, an immovable object. The men behind him exchanged a silent, unreadable look. "A pauper's grave," Diesel repeated. The gravel in his voice was gone, replaced by something cold and hard as steel. "Robbie Jennings in a dirt ditch." Claire wiped her eyes, embarrassed. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't be putting this on you. Thank you for stopping by, Jack. Robbie would have appreciated that you remembered him." She went to close the door. Diesel put a heavy, leather-clad arm out, catching the wood gently. "Which funeral home?" he asked. Claire blinked. "Gable and Sons, on Elm Street." Diesel nodded once. He didn't offer a platitude. He didn't say, "I'm sorry for your loss," or "he's in a better place now." He just turned around and walked down the broken concrete path. He swung a heavy leg over his motorcycle and kicked the stand up. "Let's ride," he barked to the pack. Engines fired up in unison, a concussive blast of sound that shook the dead leaves from the trees. Without looking back, the 12 Hell's Angels pulled out of Claire's driveway, tearing down the quiet suburban street in a tight, disciplined formation. Claire stood in the doorway, the freezing wind biting through her cardigan. She watched the red taillights disappear around the corner. The silence rushed back in, heavier than before. She closed the door, locked the deadbolt, and slid down the wall until she was sitting on the floor. She was completely alone again. Just a widow, $42, and a ticking clock. She assumed the bikers were just going to a bar to drink to Robbie's memory. That was how men like that handled death. They drank, they fought, they forgot. She had no idea that Richard Gable's quiet, perfumed afternoon was about to be violently interrupted. Richard Gable disliked noise. He had built a lucrative career entirely on hushed tones, thick carpeting, and the muffled weeping of vulnerable people. His funeral home was a fortress of enforced serenity, smelling aggressively of lemon polish and synthetic lilies. He was sitting at his mahogany desk, reviewing the profit margins on a shipment of imported brass urns, when the serenity shattered. The low-frequency vibration hit the building first, trembling the window panes. Then came the raw, mechanical thunder. Richard stood, smoothing his silk tie, his brow furrowing in irritation. He walked into the plushly carpeted lobby just as the heavy glass double doors were pushed open. They didn't knock. They didn't wipe their boots. 12 massive men strode into the lobby. They brought the outside with them, the sharp smell of ozone, exhaust, and stale cigarette smoke, cutting violently through the floral air freshener. Their heavy work boots sank into the cream-colored carpet. Chains rattled against leather. Richard froze. He was a man who understood leverage, and in this room he suddenly had absolutely none. The receptionist, a young woman named Sarah, slowly lowered herself until she was entirely hidden behind the semicircular mahogany front desk. The leader, a giant of a man with a scarred eyebrow, stopped in the center of the room. He looked at the tasteful oil paintings on the walls. He looked at the decorative fountain bubbling in the corner. Then his dark eyes locked onto Richard. "You Gable?" Diesel asked. The voice wasn't loud, but it carried the heavy, undeniable weight of a falling rock. "I am," Richard said. His throat was suddenly dry. He cleared it, trying to summon his professional authority. "Can I help you, gentlemen? This is a private business. We are currently preparing for a visitation. We're here about a friend of ours," Diesel said, closing the distance between them. He stopped 2 feet from Richard. The funeral director had to crane his neck slightly to meet the biker's eyes. Robbie Jennings. Richard's mind raced. Jennings, the mechanic, the widow with $42. "Ah," Richard said, his corporate training kicking in as a defense mechanism. "Yes, Mr. Jennings. A tragic loss. I was just speaking with his wife this morning. Unfortunately, there seems to be a financial hurdle regarding the—" "Shut up," Diesel said. He didn't shout. He didn't raise a fist. He just issued a command, and Richard's mouth clicked shut instantly. Diesel reached inside his heavy leather cut. Richard flinched, but the biker didn't pull a weapon. He pulled out a thick, bulging envelope secured with duct tape. He tossed it onto the glass coffee table in the center of the room. It landed with a heavy, solid thud. "What is the best package you got?" Diesel asked. "No cardboard boxes, no particle board, the best." Richard stared at the envelope, then back at Diesel. Our Eternal Rest package is the premier option. It includes a solid mahogany casket with brass fittings, full preparation, a 2-day viewing, and a private plot in the Whispering Pines section of the cemetery. But, gentlemen, it is exceptionally expensive. It runs nearly $12,000. "I didn't ask the price," Diesel interrupted. He gestured to the envelope with a grease-stained thumb. "Count it." Richard hesitated, then stepped forward. His hands shook slightly as he picked up the envelope. He tore the tape. Stacks of bills spilled onto the glass table. It wasn't crisp, bank-issued money. It was hundreds of crumpled 20s, stained 50s, and tightly rolled hundreds. It smelled like dive bars, spilled beer, and sweat. It was the collected cash of a dozen outlaws, emptied from pockets, stashes, and gas tanks. Richard began to count. The lobby was dead silent except for the flicking of worn paper. Diesel stood perfectly still, his thumbs hooked into his belt. The other 11 men stood behind him like a human wall, their faces completely unreadable. $12,400? Richard finally breathed, staring at the pile. "Keep the change," Diesel said. "You put Robbie in that mahogany box. You make him look good. You treat him like he was the mayor of this damn town. You give his widow the deed to the plot. Yes, of course," Richard stammered, rapidly recalculating his entire worldview. "But, if I may, who do I list as the benefactor on the invoice?" Diesel leaned in close. Richard could see the fine network of broken capillaries on the biker's cheeks. "You don't list anybody," Diesel rumbled. "You tell Claire Jennings that Robbie's accounts are settled. You tell her a clerical error was found, an old policy paid out. Whatever lie you want to spin to let that woman sleep tonight. If you tell her a bunch of bikers paid for her husband's funeral, I'll come back here and park my Harley in your lobby. Are we clear?" Richard swallowed hard. "Crystal." Diesel nodded once. He turned on his heel. "Let's ride," he muttered. The 12 men filed out as quickly as they had arrived. The glass doors swung shut. The roar of the engines flared up, shook the building one last time, and then faded down Elm Street. Richard Gable stood alone in his lobby, staring at a pile of dirty money, realizing he had just witnessed more genuine honor in 3 minutes than he had seen in 30 years of the funeral business. The morning of the funeral was bitter cold, the sky a bruised purple. Claire sat in the passenger seat of her neighbor's car, clutching her purse. She was numb. 2 days ago, Richard Gable had called her. He sounded different. Shaken, almost. He told her there had been a miraculous discovery. An old, fully paid burial policy Robbie had apparently purchased years ago through a defunct trade union. Everything was covered. The premium casket, the plot, the service. Claire didn't believe in miracles. The math didn't make sense. Robbie kept meticulous records. There was no secret policy. But she was too exhausted, too deeply hollowed out by grief to question it. If the universe was finally making a clerical error in her favor, she was going to let it happen. Robbie was going to get a dignified goodbye. When her neighbor's car turned onto Elm Street, Claire gasped. She had expected an empty parking lot. She had expected to sit alone in a large, silent room with a priest who didn't know her husband's name. Instead, Elm Street was choked with metal. Over 50 heavy motorcycles were parked in perfectly straight, gleaming rows along the curb and filling the funeral home's expansive lot. Men and women in heavy leather jackets stood in quiet clusters on the manicured lawns. There were patches from Oakhaven, from the neighboring county, and from charters 3 states away. Word had traveled. A mechanic who fixed a stranded biker's rig for free wasn't just a guy doing a favor. In their world, he was a legend. He was a civilian who saw them as human beings when the rest of the world saw them as a nuisance. Local police cruisers sat at the intersections, lights flashing lazily, but the officers were leaning against their cars, just watching. There was no trouble to police. The discipline among the crowd was absolute. As Claire stepped out of the car, the conversation stopped. The silence rippled outward like a wave. Dozens of rough, tattooed, hardened men and women turned to face her. In unison, hands reached up. Helmets were removed, hats were taken off. Cigarettes were extinguished. They parted, creating a wide, clear path to the front doors. Claire walked through the sea of leather and denim. Her breath plumed in the freezing air. Nobody spoke, but the respect was a physical weight pressing against her. She recognized Diesel standing near the door, his cuts freshly oiled, his boots shined. He offered her a single, slow nod as she passed. Inside, the chapel was unrecognizable. The massive mahogany casket sat at the front, gleaming under the soft lights. It was beautiful. It was everything Robbie deserved, and it was surrounded by flowers. Not the cheap, sparse arrangements from the funeral home, but massive wreaths of deep red roses and white lilies. The chapel filled up behind her. Every pew was packed. Men who usually communicated through revving engines and closed fists sat with their hands folded quietly in their laps. The service was short. The hired minister spoke about a man he didn't know, but the people in the room knew him. They knew the grease permanently stained into his knuckles. They knew the quiet smile he gave when an engine finally turned over. When it was time, the pallbearers stepped forward. The funeral director didn't have to assign them. Diesel walked to the front. 5 other men wearing the death head patch joined him. They gripped the heavy brass handles of the mahogany box. They lifted Robbie Jennings with effortless strength and carried him out to the waiting hearse. At the cemetery, the frozen ground had been broken. The wind howled through the bare branches of the pines. Claire stood at the edge of the plot, watching the casket lower into the earth. The finality of it threatened to crush her, but she didn't fall. She couldn't, not with 50 pairs of eyes watching her back. As the crowd began to disperse, moving back toward the long line of parked motorcycles, Diesel approached her. He didn't wear his sunglasses. He looked tired, but his eyes were kind. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, pristine white envelope. He held it out to her. "What is this?" Claire asked, her voice raspy from the cold. "The boys passed a hat at the clubhouse," Diesel said, his deep voice carrying over the wind. "Turns out a lot of people remembered your husband. A lot of people remembered a free tow, or a cheap part, or just a pot of coffee when it was 20 degrees outside." Claire looked at the envelope. It was thick. "I can't take this, Jack. The funeral director told me about the insurance policy. I know you paid for this. I know what you did." Diesel's face remained a mask of stone. "I don't know what you're talking about, Mrs. Jennings. Funeral directors handle the paperwork. I just ride." He pushed the envelope gently into her gloved hand. "Robbie spent his life making sure broken things kept running. We're just making sure you can do the same. He paid his debts to the world. We pay ours." He didn't wait for a thank you. He tipped his head, turned, and walked back across the frozen grass towards the road. Claire watched him go. She looked down at the envelope in her hand, feeling the solid, heavy reality of the paper. She looked at the fresh dirt covering her husband, and for the first time in months, the crippling, suffocating weight on her chest lifted. The world was cruel. It ground you down. It took the people you loved and demanded a fee for the privilege. But standing there in the freezing wind, listening to the thunder of 50 engines firing up in a final deafening salute to a mechanic from Oakhaven, Claire realized something else. Sometimes the world remembers. Sometimes the ledger balances. And sometimes angels don't wear white wings. They wear dirty leather. Sometimes the greatest acts of humanity come from the places we least expect. Robbie's legacy wasn't in his bank account. It was in the respect he earned from those society cast aside. If this story of unexpected grace and loyalty moved you, please hit the like button and share it with someone who needs a reminder that good deeds never truly go unrewarded. Subscribe to our channel for more real, grounded stories of the human spirit. Thank you for watching.